When most teenagers are worrying about homework and wondering what to do with their lives, one Syrian boy was accidentally becoming Emperor of Rome. This is the story of Elagabalus, a child priest who somehow convinced the world's most powerful army that he should rule the world, then spent 4 years trying to turn the entire Roman Empire into his personal temple. It's a tale so wonderfully strange that if you put it in a novel, editors would probably send it back with a note saying, "Try to be more realistic." If you find yourself drawn to the untold stories of people who lived outside the lines, those who chose authenticity over acceptance, passion over prudence, and left their mark on history in ways that still surprise us, I'd be grateful if you'd consider liking this video and subscribing for more gentle journeys into the forgotten corners of the past. I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight, and what draws you to these voices from history? Thank you for being here. When the boy was born in the sun-scorched Syrian city of Emesa, no one in Rome took notice. Why would they? His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, and he was just another child in a distant province where people did peculiar things like worship meteorites. Though history would remember him very differently, and his family already suspected he was destined for something unusual. You see, he was born into the Severan dynasty, an imperial bloodline, but not the Roman part everyone talks about. His world was all incense and ritual, sacred music drifting through marble corridors, and the constant presence of gods that had been old when Rome was still a collection of mud huts. Is rather like being born into a family business, except the business happened to be managing the relationship between earth and heaven. The boy's family were priests, caretakers of the cult of Elagabalus, a powerful sun deity whose worship centered around a black cone-shaped meteorite. Now, if you're thinking that worshipping a space rock sounds a bit odd, you're probably not alone. But this particular space rock was believed to have fallen from the heavens as a gift from the sun god himself. It lived in a magnificent temple atop a hill in Emesa, a site so sacred that the entire city's identity revolved around it. Imagine if your hometown's main claim to fame was a divine meteorite, and you'll get the idea. From a very young age, Varius was groomed to serve this god, not just symbolically with weekend services, but as a full-time occupation. Around age 10, he was made high priest of Elagabalus, which meant being dressed in robes heavy enough to require good posture, performing rituals that connected him to spiritual traditions that made Roman religion look positively modern. For a boy who should have been learning Latin grammar, he was instead learning how to speak directly to the sun. Meanwhile, his mother Julia Soaemias was ambitious in that particularly dangerous way that Roman women of noble families often were. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, was even more ambitious, which is saying something. Both women had lived in Rome, moved in imperial circles, and developed the kind of political instincts that come from watching emperors rise and fall with alarming frequency. They understood that in the Roman world, power was often just one assassination away from changing hands completely. When Emperor Caligula met his predictably violent end in 217 BC, and the throne was claimed by a man named Macrinus, Julia Maesa saw an opportunity that was either brilliant or completely insane, possibly both. She decided to claim that her grandson, this teenage priest from Syria, was actually Caligula's secret illegitimate son. It was a bold lie, the kind that needed significant amounts of gold and armed men to become believable. Fortunately, Maesa had access to both. She began what can only be described as history's most expensive marketing campaign, spreading coins and stories among the Syrian legions, promising that if they backed her grandson, they would be serving a true heir to the throne. It's worth noting that these soldiers were stationed far from Rome, where fact-checking was considerably more difficult, and loyalty was often more about regular pay than constitutional legitimacy. The gamble worked with the kind of success that probably surprised even Maesa. In 218 BC, at just 14 years old, Varius was proclaimed Emperor of Rome by troops who had never seen him rule anything more complex than a religious ceremony. From temple to throne in a matter of months is the kind of career change that makes you wonder about the Roman Empire's hiring practices. He took a new name, as emperors do, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. But the world would remember him by the name of his god, Elagabalus. It's rather fitting when you think about it, since he never really stopped being a priest who just happened to have acquired an empire as a side project. The journey to Rome must have been extraordinary. He didn't travel alone, of course. His court, his religious retinue, and most importantly, his mother and grandmother accompanied him. But this wasn't just a political procession, it was a spiritual migration. Elagabalus wasn't heading to Rome to become Roman, he was going to make Rome into something entirely different. By the time his procession approached the capital, he was already behaving less like a future emperor and more like a deity making a royal visit to a particularly large temple that happened to be called an empire. He saw himself as a living god, the chosen vessel of Elagabalus, sent to bring divine order to a world that clearly didn't understand proper sun worship. Rome noticed, and not in a good way. The Senate, nobles, priests, and even common citizens began whispering as soon as they saw him. Here was their new emperor, a teenage boy who wore makeup and perfumes instead of military decorations. He dressed in flowing silks instead of practical togas, often decorated with gold embroidery and colours that screamed expensive foreign textiles. When he spoke in public, it wasn't about Roman glory or military campaigns, but about the sun, the heavens, and his personal relationship with cosmic forces. His entourage looked like something from a fever dream. Dancers, eunuchs, fortune-tellers, and magicians, all trailing behind an emperor who seemed more interested in divine mysteries than the mundane business of running an empire. Some Romans were genuinely fascinated by the spectacle. Most were quietly horrified, the way you might be if your new CEO showed up to the board meeting dressed as a space priest. It's easy to dismiss Elagabalus as just another eccentric footnote in Rome's long catalogue of strange rulers. But when you look closer, something more complicated emerges. This was a child, a genuine teenager, raised in a completely different culture, suddenly holding the most powerful position on earth. To Elagabalus, merging spiritual and political power wasn't revolutionary thinking. It was simply how the world was supposed to work. His god had always been everything. Why wouldn't Rome understand that? The culture clash was immediate and profound, though it played out through symbols and ceremonies rather than open warfare. Within months of his arrival, Elagabalus built the Elagabalium, a new temple atop the Palatine Hill, sacred Roman ground that had never been used for foreign gods. It housed his beloved black meteorite, which had been transported to Rome in what can only be described as the ancient world's most elaborate moving day. Picture this: the emperor himself leading the sacred stone through the streets in a chariot pulled by white horses, facing backward as a sign of humility to his god. The entire city turned out to watch, lined along the route as incense burned from braziers and musicians played haunting Eastern melodies. For one surreal day, Rome felt less like the capital of an empire and more like a conquered city witnessing its new god's victory parade. He declared Elagabalus the supreme deity of Rome, ranking above Jupiter, Mars, and every other god Romans had been worshipping for centuries. All religious ceremonies were to be adapted to include the Syrian sun god, which must have made for some awkward conversations among the traditional priesthood. Some adapted with the flexibility of career diplomats, others quietly resisted, probably wondering if this was all some elaborate test of their faith. But theology was just the beginning of Rome's bewilderment. Elagabalus's court became a theatre of beautiful chaos, where Roman traditions were gently turned upside down and shaken until all the conventional pieces fell out. Gender roles blurred like watercolours in rain. Social hierarchies twisted into new shapes. Class structures became more like gentle suggestions than rigid laws. Perhaps most memorably, he ordered his slaves and attendants to serve at banquets completely naked, not hidden away in private chambers, but right there in full view of senators and distinguished guests. Imagine being a dignified Roman official expecting a normal state dinner and finding yourself trying to maintain a serious political conversation while naked servants glided around offering wine and dates. It's the kind of situation that really tests your diplomatic training. He bathed in perfumes that cost more than most people's annual income, wore jewellery that would have made Egyptian queens envious, and applied cosmetics before addressing the Senate with the careful attention most people reserve for job interviews. They were imperial statements, broadcast to an empire that was still trying to figure out what exactly it was witnessing. The most shocking development, at least to traditional Roman sensibilities, was Elagabalus's open relationship with men, particularly his marriage to a charioteer named Heracles. Now, Roman attitudes towards sexuality were complex and often contradictory, but this went beyond what even the most flexible social boundaries could accommodate. Elagabalus didn't just love this man, he called him his husband, referred to himself as Hierocles' wife and mistress, not as metaphor or private endearment, but as public identity. And then he gave Hierocles power, titles, and access to imperial circles, essentially making a man whose job involved racing horses around a track into one of the most influential people in the empire. For the Roman elite, this wasn't just a personal scandal, it was a complete inversion of everything they understood about proper order. A foreign teenager was flaunting a relationship that defied their moral laws while elevating a stable worker to their level. It's hard to imagine a more effective way to offend traditional sensibilities. Meanwhile, his religious integration project was expanding in ways that probably seemed logical to him, but baffled everyone else. He ordered sacred relics from other religions to be brought to the Elagabalium, the Palladium of Troy, symbols of Mithras, Jewish and Christian artifact, all forced to pay homage to Elagabal. Picture this teenage emperor, barely old enough to need a razor, deciding that what Rome really needed was for every sacred object in the known world to come meet his meteorite. It was like organising the ultimate interfaith gathering, except none of the faiths had actually agreed to participate. In his mind, this was divine diplomacy, uniting all spiritual traditions under the sun, God's universal love. From the Roman perspective, their carefully organised religious world was being systematically dismantled by a boy who seemed to think gods worked like a fantasy sports league where you could trade players between teams. His public banquets became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Some featured hundreds of exotic birds and guests literally drowning in rose petals, which sounds romantic until you consider the practical difficulties of trying to eat dinner while buried in flowers. Other times he served empty dishes as elaborate jokes, or released wild animals into dining halls just to watch distinguished senators scramble onto tables. Servants appeared in costumes, their bodies oiled and perfumed like living sculptures, while Hierocles sometimes hosted alongside the emperor, treating charioteers and generals as equals in conversation. This wasn't mere extravagance, it was performance art with a political message. Every bizarre banquet was a gentle but firm statement that the old rules no longer applied, that Roman dignity was optional, and that the emperor's vision of reality was now the only one that mattered. The whispers grew louder. Some claimed the emperor practiced mysterious Eastern magic. Others insisted they witnessed child sacrifice. Though modern scholars generally dismiss such accusations as the kind of wild propaganda that tends to attach itself to unpopular rulers. There were persistent rumours of multiple secret marriages to both men and women, sometimes several in a single year, as if the emperor was collecting spouses like particularly attractive souvenirs. And then there was Elagabalus's relationship with their own body, a source of endless fascination and confusion for Roman observers. According to historians like Cassius Dio, the emperor requested to be called Lady and Empress, may have attempted self-castration, and reportedly asked physicians if surgical procedures existed that could provide a woman's body. Some modern scholars interpret this as possibly the first recorded request for gender reassignment in history. It's tempting to view this through a contemporary lens, to see Elagabalus as a pioneering figure of gender expression centuries ahead of their time. And perhaps they were. But it's also important to recognise the complexity of the situation. This was someone with unlimited power making imperial declarations about identity, backed by the resources of the world's largest empire. Their personal exploration became public policy. Their private struggles became matters of state. The refusal to conform extended to every aspect of governance. Elagabalus largely ignored military affairs, treating warfare like a tedious family obligation. Senate meetings became optional from the imperial perspective, with the emperor sometimes not bothering to attend discussions about running the empire. Roman officials found themselves replaced by the emperor's personal favourites, dancers, actors, charioteers and lovers, regardless of their qualifications for administrative work. Imperial property was given away as casual gifts, the way most people might share candy. Laws were dismissed as unnecessarily rigid, and major decisions were made based on dreams, omens, or what the emperor happened to be feeling that particular morning. One historian claimed that public offices were assigned by spinning a wheel, though this might be the ancient equivalent of fake news, the kind of story that sounds too perfect not to repeat, whether or not it actually happened. The emperor mocked senators both behind their backs and occasionally to their faces, treating the empire's governing body like a particularly stuffy social club that took itself too seriously. Rome began to feel less like a government and more like an elaborate performance piece directed by a teenager with unlimited resources and very specific artistic vision. And yet, remarkably, the empire didn't collapse into immediate chaos. Tax collectors still collected taxes, though they might now be wearing silk instead of wool. Roads continued to be maintained, even if the maintenance crews occasionally had to accommodate religious processions featuring meteorites. Soldiers were fed and paid, though they might be wondering why their emperor spent more time on makeup than the military strategy. The vast administrative machinery of empire is surprisingly resilient. Even unusual hands can keep the wheels turning, at least for a while. But at the heart of everything, the distance between Elagabalus and traditional Roman expectations was growing impossibly wide. The Praetorian Guard, elite soldiers who had been bought with Julia Macer's gold, began to grow restless as they watched a palace that seemed to operate more like an experimental theatre than a centre of government. The Senate, repeatedly humiliated by an emperor who treated their ancient dignity as an amusing curiosity, began to murmur among themselves about alternative arrangements. Even the common people, who had initially watched the exotic processions with fascination, began to look away. The novelty was wearing off, and underneath the spectacle, Rome was starting to feel ungoverned, adrift, ruled by a beautiful dream that had somehow lost touch with practical reality. Most dangerously of all, Julia Macer, the grandmother who had engineered this entire extraordinary rise to power, began to question whether her creation was still serving her purposes. By 221 BC, the golden dream was turning cold around the edges. The palace still glowed with braziers and rang with exotic music, still hosted banquets where guests drowned in rose petals and marvelled at naked servants bearing honeyed wine. But the warmth that had once surrounded Elagabalus, that intoxicating sense of unlimited possibility, was quietly evaporating. The emperor was now 17, still technically a teenager, but in Roman terms already an old man measured by the chaos of his reign. The Senate functioned only when it felt like it. The military remained loyal primarily because they were still being paid, though their loyalty was becoming a purely business arrangement. The people of Rome, who had once lined streets to witness sacred processions, now watched from behind shuttered windows, the way you might observe a neighbour's loud party that's gone on too long. Most ominously, Julia Macer had begun paying attention to her other grandson. Severus Alexander, son of her other daughter Julia Mamaea, was everything Elagabalus was not. Quiet, conventionally Roman in appearance, respectful of traditional boundaries, and most importantly, completely manageable. In the eyes of the Roman elite, he represented a return to normalcy, a chance to wake up from the beautiful but exhausting dream of divine rule. Sensing this shift like an animal sensing approaching weather, Elagabalus began to panic in the way that only absolute rulers can, by making increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control. Officials suspected of supporting Alexander found themselves suddenly unemployed. His cousin's access to court was restricted, then eliminated. The emperor even began plotting assassination, as if removing Alexander could somehow restore the magic that was leaking out of his reign. But by this time, the Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers who had once elevated him to divine status, had already made their decision. They were practical men who understood that emperors come and go, but smart soldiers survive by backing winners, and Elagabalus, for all his divine connections, was beginning to look distinctly mortal. The emperor, perhaps sensing the approaching end with the intuition that comes from living constantly on the edge of impossibility, began withdrawing from public view. He grew more erratic, hosting midnight rituals that lasted until dawn, issuing contradictory orders that confused even his most loyal servants. He clung more desperately to his mother, Julia Soaemias, who remained devoted to her son even as their shared world crumbled around them. In early 222 BC, Elagabalus made his final fatal miscalculation. He appeared before the Praetorian Guard at their camp, demanding the execution of his cousin Alexander. He brought his mother with him, perhaps hoping her presence would remind the soldiers of the family that had made them rich, or perhaps simply because he was still young enough to need his mother when facing the end of everything he'd known. The boy emperor who had once been worshipped as a living god now stood trembling before soldiers who barely bothered to conceal their disgust. When they refused his orders, quietly at first, then loudly, then with the kind of finality that ends conversations forever, he fled back to the palace like the frightened teenager he had always been underneath the divine robes. By nightfall, it was over with the swift brutality that Rome reserved for inconvenient rulers. The Praetorian Guards stormed the imperial residence, their intentions as sharp as their blades. Elagabalus and his mother tried to hide. Some sources say in a chest, others mention a closet. The kind of detail that gets confused when history is written by people who weren't there to take careful notes. They were found quickly, as people hiding in palaces usually are. There was no dramatic trial, no final speech, no opportunity for the kind of noble exit that emperors sometimes manage in better stories. They were simply killed, mother and son together, the way you might eliminate any other problem that had grown too large to ignore. Their bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome, battered by stones and fists, their faces destroyed beyond recognition. The boy who had once ruled as a god was stripped naked, a final cruel echo of the naked servants at his banquets, and thrown into the Tiber River like refuse. Just like that, the sun god's earthly representative became another corpse floating in the same waters that had welcomed so many fallen emperors before him. There's something chilling about how efficiently the Roman system disposed of what it no longer wanted. One day, a person is worshipped dressed in gold, paraded before cheering crowds. The next, their body feeds the fish in the river that flows past temples, where other gods are already being honoured by new priests with more acceptable beliefs. But Elagabalus had left marks that couldn't be easily erased. The Senate immediately declared damnatio memoriae, official deletion from history. Statues were methodically smashed. Names were scraped off monuments with the thoroughness of ancient Google removing search results. Coins bearing the imperial image were melted down for more practical metal. Laws were annulled as if they had never existed, and the great temple of Elagabal was stripped of its foreign god and rededicated to more traditional Roman purposes. And yet, as so often happens with attempts to erase the past, the very effort to forget ensured that people would remember. Too many had witnessed the spectacle, too many had stories to tell, and perhaps most significantly, too many remained fascinated by what they had seen. The historians who chronicled Elagabalus's reign, Cassius Dio, Herodian, and the compilers of the Historia Augusta, didn't treat him as merely another failed political figure. They wrote about him as if he were a phenomenon, a warning, a symbol of everything they feared about the collision between East and West, tradition and innovation, male and female, human and divine. To them, Elagabalus represented the anti-Rome, everything their civilization defined itself against. And in writing about him with such horrified fascination, they ensured that he would outlive his attempted erasure, becoming something more than just a dead emperor. He became a myth, a cautionary tale, and paradoxically, a kind of immortality. In the centuries that followed, each generation rediscovered Elagabalus and found different meanings in his story. Medieval chroniclers saw divine punishment for moral corruption. Renaissance artists found inspiration in the exotic beauty of Eastern mystery religions. Romantic poets celebrated him as a tragic figure destroyed by narrow-minded convention. In more recent times, some have claimed him as an early icon of gender fluidity and sexual liberation, while others continue to see him as proof that decadence inevitably leads to collapse. Neither interpretation captures the full complexity of a Syrian priest-child who accidentally acquired an empire and spent 4 years trying to remake the world according to his personal vision of the divine order. Perhaps the most honest thing we can say is that Elagabalus was fundamentally a product of circumstances no one could have predicted. A collision between Syrian mysticism and Roman politics, teenage psychology and absolute power, ancient traditions and innovative thinking. He was someone who refused to be what others expected, who insisted on authenticity even when it meant destruction, who chose personal truth over political survival. The language we use to describe Elagabalus remains complicated, shifting with each generation's values and understanding. Was he a boy forced into an impossible role, a gender non-conforming teenager who ruled an empire and paid the ultimate price, or simply a foreign priest lost in a political world he never fully understood? The answer probably contains elements of all these interpretations and several others we haven't thought of yet. What we know with certainty is that he mattered and continues to matter. His story speaks to anyone who has ever felt like a stranger in their own life, anyone who has tried to change the world according to their personal vision, anyone who has discovered that being authentically yourself can be both liberating and dangerous. Nearly 18 centuries later, we're still talking about the teenage emperor who turned Rome into his temple, who loved who he wanted to love, who wore silk and jewellery and cosmetics to Senate meetings, who demanded that the gods learn to get along, and who paid for all of it with his life. In a world that often seems to prefer convenient lies over difficult truths, there's something both inspiring and heartbreaking about someone who chose honesty, even unto death. The sun set on Elagabalus long ago, but somehow his light still reaches us across all these centuries of darkness. There's a name that has echoed through history for nearly 2,000 years, a name that makes people immediately think of madness, depravity, and power so absolute it twisted into something monstrous. That name is Caligula, the Roman emperor who supposedly turned his palace into a brothel, made his horse a government official, and tortured an empire with his disturbing desires. But here's the thing about history, and it's rather wonderful when you think about it. Almost everything you believe you know about Caligula is probably wrong, not slightly inaccurate or somewhat exaggerated, but fundamentally beautifully wrong in the way that only centuries of gossip transformed into historical fact can be. It's like a massive game of telephone that lasted 2 millennia, except instead of ending with something silly about purple elephants, it ended with one of history's most persistent character assassinations. March 37 AD arrived in Rome like the first warm day of spring after a particularly long winter. After 23 years under the gloomy, paranoid rule of Tiberius, an emperor who had basically turned governance into an exercise in professional suspicion, the Romans finally had a new leader. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, though absolutely everyone called him Caligula, which means little boots. It's the kind of nickname that makes you smile just hearing it, earned during his childhood when he wandered around army camps wearing tiny military gear that made hardened soldiers melt with affection. Imagine, if you will, the relief that must have swept through Rome. Here was their new emperor, young, handsome, generous in that effortless way that comes from never having worried about money, and blessed with the kind of natural charisma that makes people want to be in the same room as you. For 8 glorious months, Caligula was everything Romans had been dreaming of during the long grey years under Tiberius. He recalled political exiles with the magnanimity of someone giving out pardons at a holiday party. He handed out bonuses to soldiers like a wealthy uncle at a family reunion. He threw spectacular gladiatorial games that made people forget that entertainment could be anything less than absolutely extraordinary. For those 8 months, Rome must have felt like it had won some cosmic lottery. Then something changed, and this is where the story gets genuinely mysterious. In late 37 AD, Caligula fell desperately ill. Not just a simple fever, but the kind of sickness that makes everyone gather around whispering and making desperate bargains with whatever gods they happen to favour. Delirium, high fever, the whole terrifying collection of symptoms that made wealthy Romans suddenly very interested in medical science. For weeks, ordinary citizens found themselves praying for the recovery of an emperor they barely knew, simply because the alternative seemed too frightening to contemplate. When he finally emerged from his sick room, something had shifted. He seemed paranoid where he had once been trusting, cruel where he had been generous, and convinced of his own divinity in a way that made everyone slightly uncomfortable. At least, that's what the stories would have you believe. But here's where our tale becomes truly fascinating, in the way that detective stories always are when you discover the most obvious suspect probably didn't commit the crime. Every single one of these dramatic stories about Caligula's transformation comes from sources who weren't even alive when he ruled. Suetonius, who wrote the most scandalous and widely quoted biography, was documenting events that had happened 80 years before he was born. Cassius Dio was writing his account a century and a half after Caligula's death. These weren't eyewitness reports. They were essentially collecting decades of gossip, rumour, and what we might politely call political creative writing. Think about it for a moment, and you'll realise how wonderfully absurd this is. Would you trust a biography of a modern political figure if it were written entirely from social media rumours and campaign attack ads? Because that's essentially what we're dealing with here. Except instead of Twitter, we have Roman graffiti, and instead of cable news, we have whatever people were saying at dinner parties in 120 AD. The Roman Empire had a problem after Caligula's assassination, the kind of problem that requires creative storytelling to solve. He had been murdered after just 4 years in power, and the people who came after him needed to explain why this had been not just acceptable, but morally necessary. The easiest solution, and the one humans have been using since we first learned to tell stories around fires, was to transform the victim into a monster. Make him so morally corrupt, so dangerously unstable that assassination looked less like political murder, and the stories they created, they were incredible, in both senses of the word. Caligula allegedly made his horse a consul, which would have been hilarious if it weren't completely impractical from an administrative standpoint. He declared himself a living god. Awkward in a society that preferred their emperors to wait until death for deification. And yes, he supposedly turned his palace into a brothel where he forced senators' wives to work while their husbands watched. A tale so perfectly designed to shock that it practically guaranteed its own immortality. These stories spread through Rome with the enthusiasm that good gossip always generates, each retelling adding new details, fresh horrors, and increasingly elaborate embellishments. It's human nature, really. Tell someone a moderately scandalous story, and by the time it reaches the sixth person, it's become something that would make professional storytellers jealous of its dramatic complexity. But when you strip away the sensational claims and look at what we can actually verify happened, a different picture emerges. Not of a cackling madman who woke up each morning wondering what new depravity he could inflict on the world, but of a young ruler who inherited impossible power at age 24 and had absolutely no idea how to handle it responsibly. The documented facts of Caligula's early life read like a training manual for producing political paranoia. His father, Germanicus, had been Rome's golden boy, a beloved general whose mysterious death when Caligula was just 7 years old sparked conspiracy theories that lasted for decades. His mother, Agrippina, spent years afterward fighting Tiberius over her family's rights, engaging in the kind of palace intrigue that makes modern political drama look like children's theatre. Young Caligula grew up watching family members disappear into exile or death, learning that in Roman politics you either dominate completely or get destroyed utterly. There's no comfortable middle ground where you can be moderately successful and retire to write your memoirs. By the time he became emperor, he had already absorbed the fundamental lesson of imperial survival. In this world, it's much safer to be feared than loved, and safest of all to be both simultaneously. His first months as emperor show someone desperately, almost touchingly, trying to be adored by everyone at once. He completed building projects that Tiberius had abandoned with the enthusiasm of someone finishing a beloved relative's unfinished novel. He gave gladiator games that lasted for days, the kind of spectacle that makes people forget they ever had complaints about government policy. He recalled political exiles and pardoned prisoners with the magnanimity of someone who genuinely believed that generosity could solve most of Rome's problems. The Senate loved him because he seemed to respect their traditions. The people adored him because he gave them entertainment and gifts. The army respected him because he was Germanicus' son. For those brief, shining months, it must have seemed like Rome had finally found the perfect emperor, someone who could balance all the competing interests that made governance such an exhausting juggling act. But Rome's finances were a catastrophe, and this is where the real story begins to emerge from behind all the dramatic mythology. Tiberius had spent decades hoarding money with the dedication of someone who genuinely believed that saving was a virtue in itself. When Caligula opened the imperial treasury, he found it stuffed with gold that had been sitting unused while the empire's infrastructure crumbled and its people grumbled about inadequate public services. So he spent it, lavishly, enthusiastically, and with the kind of financial optimism that comes from never having worried about money personally. Games, buildings, gifts to citizens, bonuses to soldiers. Within a year, he had burned through reserves that had taken decades to accumulate. It's the kind of mistake that's easy to understand when you realize he was essentially a trust fund kid who had just inherited the world's largest trust fund and had no adult supervision. That's when the real problems started. And they were mundane problems. the kind that don't make for exciting stories but do make for catastrophic politics. Desperate for money, he began inventing new taxes with the creativity of someone who had never considered that wealth has limits. He auctioned off gladiators at inflated prices, essentially forcing wealthy Romans to participate in what amounted to an elaborate extortion scheme. He started confiscating property from wealthy families on increasingly creative legal pretexts. The same Senate that had loved him 8 months earlier now watched their fortunes disappear into imperial projects and began to remember why they had been suspicious of young emperors in the first place. It's a pattern as old as politics itself. Financial crisis leads to unpopular policies, which lead to political opposition, which leads to increasingly desperate measures to maintain control. Here's what's truly intriguing about this whole story. These financial troubles and political conflicts are thoroughly documented. Roman bureaucrats kept records of the taxes, the auctions, the confiscations, and the growing tension between emperor and senate. But somehow, over the decades and centuries that followed, these boring administrative failures got transformed into tales of sexual depravity and murderous insanity. Why? Because quite simply, boring doesn't sell. A story about a young emperor who mismanaged finances and alienated the political establishment? That's just Tuesday in Rome. A story about an emperor who declared himself a god and turned his palace into a brothel? That's the kind of tale that gets people leaning forward at dinner parties, the kind that gets copied and recopied until it becomes immortal. The transformation happened gradually, the way these things always do. Political opponents would whisper about Caligula's excesses, using the kind of vague language that lets people fill in their own scandalous details. Those whispers became anecdotes shared at social gatherings. The anecdotes became commonly accepted stories. And eventually the stories became historical facts that no one questioned because everyone already knew they were true. Once something becomes accepted as historical fact, it's almost impossible to erase, no matter how flimsy the original evidence might have been. Even today, nearly 2,000 years later, mention Caligula's name and people immediately think of madness and sexual depravity. The actual truth, that he was probably just an inexperienced ruler who made catastrophic political mistakes while dealing with inherited financial problems, gets lost in the dramatic mythology that's so much more memorable than mere reality. So what about that brothel? The story that has followed Caligula like a shadow for 2,000 years, the tale that makes people's skin crawl and ensures that his name will forever be associated with the darkest possibilities of absolute power. According to Suetonius, our ancient tabloid journalist, Caligula set up a brothel in his palace, forcing senators' wives and daughters to work there while their husbands and fathers watched helplessly. The account claims he posted prices for different women like items on a restaurant menu, and collected the profits personally, as if running an empire wasn't lucrative enough, and he needed a side business in human degradation. It's exactly the kind of story that sticks in human memory like a burr, so perfectly crafted to shock and horrify that questioning it almost feels inappropriate. But let's examine this claim with the patience of detectives who aren't particularly impressed by dramatic storytelling. First, let's consider our source. Suetonius wasn't writing academic history. He was creating entertainment for wealthy Romans who wanted to read shocking stories about dead emperors while reclining on expensive couches. Think of him as the ancient equivalent of a celebrity biography writer, someone whose job was to collect the juiciest gossip and present it in the most compelling way possible. His book, Lives of the Caesars, was designed to titillate readers, not to inform scholars, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as we remember what we're actually reading. When Suetonius writes that Caligula set up a brothel in his palace, and sent his guards to invite, or rather summon, married women and freeborn youths, notice something crucial. He gives no specific names, no particular dates, no actual witnesses. For such an extraordinary claim, one that would have required extensive planning, significant staff, and considerable logistics, the details are remarkably, almost suspiciously vague. Compare this to what we can actually verify about Caligula's relationships with women. He was married 4 times, and these are documented marriages with specific dates, witness ceremonies, and clear political purposes. His first wife, Junia Claudilla, died in childbirth, a genuine tragedy that seems to have affected him deeply. His second marriage to Livia Orestilla lasted only a few months, ended for reasons that probably made sense at the time. His third wife, Lollia Paulina, was chosen for her considerable wealth, and he divorced her once that wealth had served its political purpose. His fourth marriage to Caesonia was to an older woman who already had children, hardly the choice you'd expect from someone allegedly obsessed with sexual conquest. These marriages follow completely recognizable political patterns. Roman emperors used marriage as a tool of statecraft, forming alliances, securing wealth, and managing succession issues. There's nothing in this documented record that suggests sexual obsession or unusual personal desires. It's the marriage pattern of someone thinking strategically about power, not romantically about pleasure. But here's where our detective story gets truly interesting. There actually were records of what happened at Caligula's famous parties, because Roman banquets weren't private affairs. They were elaborate social and political events, with specific protocols, detailed guest lists, and careful attention to precedence and proper behaviour. Roman dinner parties were where the real business of empire got conducted. Guests reclined on expensive couches, ate carefully prepared delicacies, and were entertained by professional musicians, dancers and actors while negotiating everything from trade agreements to marriage alliances. These gatherings were networking events for the elite, places where fortunes were made, political careers were launched, and social connections were carefully cultivated. Caligula's banquets were notorious, but the documented complaints weren't about sexual impropriety, they were about expense. He served exotic foods that cost more than most people's annual income, hired entertainers whose fees could have funded public works projects, and gave gifts to guests that left them feeling obligated to reciprocate with interest. One senator wrote that attending Caligula's dinner parties was financially ruinous, not because of any moral corruption, but simply because the social expectations had become impossibly expensive. The emperor also used these gatherings for political theatre, humiliating opponents in ways that were cruel but perfectly legal. He'd force senators to serve wine like common slaves, make them perform degrading tasks in front of their peers, or publicly mock their wives' appearance with the kind of calculated cruelty that political bullies have always favoured. These power games were designed to establish dominance and remind everyone exactly who controlled their careers and social standing. So where did the brothel story come from, and why has it proven so remarkably durable? Roman politics had a long, ignoble tradition of using sexual allegations to destroy political enemies. Accuse someone of sexual deviance, and you didn't need proof. The accusation itself became a weapon that could damage reputations for generations. We see this pattern throughout Roman history, where political opponents were routinely discredited through accusations of improper behaviour, regardless of whether those claims had any basis in reality. The brothel story also tapped into a specific Roman anxiety about imperial power. Romans feared emperors who treated free citizens like slaves, who ignored the traditional boundaries between public and private space, between political authority and personal whim. The idea of forcing freeborn women into prostitution represented the ultimate violation of Roman social order. It was designed to be the most horrifying thing readers could imagine an emperor doing. But there's a wonderfully practical problem with the brothel story that becomes obvious once you think about the logistics involved. The Roman palace wasn't a private residence where an emperor could conduct secret activities. It was a massive government building where hundreds of people worked every day. Secretaries copying documents, guards patrolling corridors, servants maintaining the building, officials conducting the daily business of empire. A brothel operation would have required extensive staff, careful security, detailed financial records, and the cooperation of dozens of people who would have had to keep quiet about it forever. Yet we have no administrative documents, no payment records, no testimony from any of the army of people who would have necessarily been involved in such an operation. For an empire that documented everything from military supply purchases to public bathroom maintenance, the complete absence of any bureaucratic evidence is rather telling. Ancient sources do mention specific instances of Caligula's political cruelty that sound much more plausible. He allegedly forced a father to watch his son's execution, then invited him to dinner the same evening with the casual brutality of someone testing the limits of human endurance. He's said to have made political opponents run alongside his chariot in the Mediterranean heat until they collapse from exhaustion. These stories, while still unverified, fit the documented pattern of an emperor who used psychological torture as a tool of political control. The brothel story, by contrast, serves no apparent political purpose. It's pure sensationalism, designed to shock rather than intimidate, to entertain rather than control. There's also the timeline problem that becomes apparent when you actually count the months. Caligula ruled for less than 4 years. The first year was spent being popular and spending money. The last year was consumed with fighting off assassination plots and managing various political crises. That leaves perhaps 2 years during which he supposedly managed to run a palace brothel while simultaneously governing an empire, dealing with financial disasters, fighting military campaigns, and conducting the kind of complex diplomacy that kept Roman provinces from erupting into rebellion. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing much closer to Caligula's actual lifetime, mentions the emperor's shameful excesses, but gives no specific details about what those excesses might have involved. Later historians like Cassius Dio repeat Suetonius's claims, but add no new evidence, no additional witnesses, no corroborating documentation. The story doesn't grow stronger with time, it just gets repeated more often until repetition itself becomes a kind of proof. Modern historians studying Caligula's reign focus on what can actually be verified through archaeological evidence, administrative records, and contemporary documents. His ambitious building projects, his military campaigns, his financial policies, and his increasingly volatile conflicts with the Senate. The sexual allegations barely register in serious academic scholarship because there's simply no credible evidence to support them. The brothel story tells us far more about Roman propaganda techniques than it does about Caligula's actual behaviour. It's a perfect example of how political enemies can destroy someone's reputation for centuries, creating myths so compelling that they become more real than reality, so memorable that they outlive any possible refutation. So who was the real Caligula? Once we strip away the centuries of dramatic mythology and focus on what we can actually verify through the patient work of historians sifting through evidence. Let's start with something solid and undeniable: infrastructure. While later writers were crafting elaborate stories about sexual scandals and divine madness, Caligula was building things. Real, substantial, useful things that required engineering expertise and administrative competence. He completed the Temple of Augustus that Tiberius had left unfinished, constructed new aqueducts to bring fresh water to Rome's growing population, built a harbour at Rhegium, and expanded the port facilities at Syracuse. These aren't the projects of a madman, they're the work of someone thinking seriously about Rome's long-term needs and trying to leave a lasting legacy of practical improvement. But here's where Caligula's political inexperience becomes glaringly obvious. Roman emperors were expected to function as master diplomats, carefully balancing the competing interests of various powerful groups: the army, which needed to be kept loyal and well paid; the Senate, which controlled much of the administrative machinery; the common people, who could riot if sufficiently unhappy; and the provincial governors, who could cause serious problems if they felt neglected or threatened. Caligula seems to have decided that this complex balancing act was unnecessarily complicated. Instead, he chose to favour the people and the army while openly antagonising the Senate, which is roughly equivalent to deciding that juggling is too difficult, and you'd prefer to just throw all the balls in the same direction and hope for the best. Take his relationship with the Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers whose official job was protecting the emperor, but whose unofficial role was deciding which emperors deserved to continue breathing. Caligula gave them massive bonuses that the treasury couldn't afford, and allowed them to behave in ways that would have gotten ordinary soldiers court-martialed. He was essentially purchasing their loyalty with money that Rome didn't have, like someone buying friendship with credit cards and hoping the bills would somehow pay themselves. Meanwhile, he was systematically humiliating the Senate with the kind of theatrical cruelty that suggests someone who had never learned the difference between entertainment and governance. During one memorable Senate meeting, he allegedly brought his horse Incitatus into the chamber and announced he was considering making it a consul. Modern historians debate whether this actually happened or was intended as satirical commentary, but either way, the story perfectly captures Caligula's relationship with Rome's traditional governing body. The horse incident, whether literal or metaphorical, makes sense as political theatre with a very clear message. You senators are so fundamentally useless that even my horse could perform your duties more effectively. It's the kind of insult that might be amusing at a dinner party, but becomes catastrophically dangerous when delivered by someone with absolute power to people who control the administrative machinery of government. His building projects reveal the same pattern of grandiose gestures taking precedence over practical considerations. He started construction on a bridge across the Bay of Naples, not because the region needed improved transportation, but specifically so he could ride across it, wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, and feel like a conquering hero. The project was abandoned immediately after his death, which tells you everything you need to know about its practical value to the empire. Then there's the god complex, which, unlike the sexual allegations, is thoroughly documented and apparently quite real. Caligula built temples dedicated to his own worship, demanded that people throughout the empire recognize him as a living deity, and placed his statue in the Temple of Jerusalem, nearly triggering a Jewish revolt that could have destabilized the entire Eastern Mediterranean. He also claimed to have regular conversations with Jupiter and other gods, which his contemporaries found either fascinating or terrifying, depending on their personal views about divine communication. But even this wasn't entirely unprecedented in Roman history. Previous emperors had been deified after death, and rulers in the eastern parts of the empire had been claiming divine status for centuries. Caligula's real mistake was demanding divine honours while still alive, and while physically present in Rome, where such claims violated deeply held traditional beliefs about the proper relationship between mortals and gods. The situation in Judea nearly exploded into full-scale war when Caligula ordered his statue placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, the most sacred site in Judaism. The entire province erupted in what can only be described as organised religious panic. The Roman governor Petronius wisely stalled the order, knowing that enforcing it would require military action that could easily spread throughout the region. Only Caligula's assassination prevented what might have become a catastrophic religious war. His military campaigns reveal the same unfortunate pattern of theatrical gestures overwhelming strategic thinking. He launched an invasion of Britain with great fanfare, then stopped at the English Channel and ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war. Later sources presented this as evidence of insanity, but modern historians suspect it was probably a face-saving manoeuvre when the invasion plans fell apart due to logistical problems or political opposition. The German campaigns were more successful militarily but equally revealing about Caligula's approach to leadership. He executed several Roman officers for alleged treason, then had their bodies displayed as a warning to others. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated displays of power designed to intimidate potential rivals and remind everyone that questioning the emperor's decisions could have fatal consequences. His financial policies were disastrous but completely understandable given the impossible situation he had created for himself. Facing bankruptcy after his early spending sprees, he began auctioning off gladiators at inflated prices, essentially forcing wealthy Romans to participate in what amounted to legalized extortion. He created new inheritance taxes, revived treason trials as a method of confiscating property, and invented various fees and penalties that squeezed money from anyone who couldn't effectively resist. These measures were deeply unpopular but financially necessary, the kind of desperate expedients that governments resort to when they've painted themselves into economic corners. The wealthy Romans who found themselves paying these new taxes weren't angry because they thought Caligula was insane. They were angry because they were losing money, which is a much more practical and understandable motivation for political opposition. The conspiracy that eventually killed him formed gradually, involving people who had very specific rational reasons for wanting him dead. The main conspirators were Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian Guard officer whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated in public, and Cornelius Sabinus, another guard officer who'd grown tired of serving an emperor who treated the military like his personal entertainment crew. They were joined by senators who saw Caligula as a direct threat to their wealth, power, and traditional privileges. On January 24th, 41 AD, they struck with the efficiency of people who had been planning carefully and understood exactly what they were doing. Caligula was attending theatrical games when Chaerea and his fellow conspirators cornered him in a palace corridor and stabbed him 30 times. They also killed his wife Caesonia and their infant daughter, eliminating any possible succession claims that might complicate the political transition. The assassination wasn't motivated by moral outrage over sexual conduct or horror at divine pretensions. It was a straightforward political murder carried out by people who wanted to protect their own interests and saw Caligula as an unacceptable threat to the established order. Looking at the documented historical record, Caligula emerges as someone who fundamentally misunderstood how Roman politics actually worked. He treated the empire like his personal property, ignored the traditional constraints that kept imperial power within acceptable bounds, and systematically alienated the very people he needed to survive in a system where emperors served at the pleasure of the military and the political establishment. Was he cruel? Certainly in the casual way that people with absolute power often become when they've never learned to consider other people's feelings. Was he megalomaniacal? Absolutely, though megalomania was practically a job requirement for Roman emperors. Was he guilty of the sexual crimes that have defined his reputation for 2,000 years? The evidence suggests probably not, though given the nature of ancient historical sources, we can never be completely certain about anyone's private behaviour. The real Caligula was a young man intoxicated by unlimited power, someone who made every possible political mistake while dealing with inherited problems he didn't understand, governing an empire he wasn't prepared to manage, and trying to satisfy expectations he was never taught to meet. In the end, he paid the ultimate price not for sexual depravity or divine madness, but for the far more mundane sin of political incompetence in a world where incompetent rulers didn't get second chances. It's a perfectly human story when you strip away all the dramatic mythology, the tale of someone who inherited more responsibility than they could handle and made choices that seemed reasonable to them but proved catastrophic in practice. The fact that we've spent 2 millennia telling more exciting stories about him says more about our appetite for dramatic narratives than it does about the actual complexity of power, politics, and the perfectly ordinary ways that extraordinary people can destroy themselves. Picture Rome in 204 BC, and you'll see a city balanced on the edge of catastrophe, the way civilizations sometimes find themselves when all their usual solutions have stopped working. Hannibal had been conducting what amounted to a 14-year masterclass in military strategy across the Italian peninsula, leaving Roman armies scattered across battlefields with names that still make military historians wince. Trebia, Cannae, places where the word defeat seemed inadequate to describe what had actually happened. The Senate had tried everything their considerable experience could suggest. New generals, different strategies, sacrifices to every Roman god whose name they could remember, and quite a few whose names they had to look up. Nothing worked, which left them facing the kind of problem that forces practical people to consider impractical solutions. So they turned to their most mysterious resource, the Cybele books, those ancient Greek prophecies that Rome consulted the way modern governments might call in specialist advisors during particularly confusing crises. These sacred texts had guided the city through previous emergencies with advice that often seemed bizarre until it worked, and now they delivered perhaps the most startling recommendation in Roman history. To defeat Hannibal, according to the prophecies, Rome needed to bring the great mother goddess Cybele from her mountain shrine in Pessinus, in what we now call Turkey. It was the kind of divine diplomatic solution that probably sounded reasonable when you were desperate enough to consider anything, even importing foreign deities with interesting religious requirements. But Cybele wasn't just any international goddess looking for a new temple location. She came with the most unusual religious staff Rome had ever encountered, priests called the Galli, whose approach to spiritual devotion made traditional Roman religious practices look positively conservative by comparison. These were men who had voluntarily undergone the most profound physical sacrifice imaginable in service to their goddess, transforming themselves permanently to demonstrate their complete dedication. They wore flowing feminine clothing, grew their hair long in styles that made Roman barbers nervous, and performed ecstatic dances that challenged every assumption Romans held about proper masculine behaviour. They embodied everything that made traditional Romans uncomfortable: emotional where Roman culture prized stoicism, gender fluid where Roman society valued rigid masculine roles, and thoroughly foreign where Romans celebrated their ancestral traditions. Yet desperation has a wonderful way of making pragmatists out of even the most conservative societies. The Senate, faced with the choice between cultural discomfort and potential military annihilation, voted to bring Cybele to Rome, unusual priests and all. It's the kind of decision that probably generated enormous amounts of private grumbling, while everyone publicly agreed it was obviously the right thing to do. The goddess travelled in the form of a sacred black meteorite, which must have made for interesting shipping arrangements. Loaded onto a vessel that sailed from Pessinus to the mouth of the Tiber, This divine cargo carried with it the hopes of a civilization that had run out of conventional military options. According to later Roman historians like Livy, when the ship mysteriously ran aground near Rome, only Claudia Quinta, a Roman noblewoman whose reputation had been questioned by society gossips, could free it by touching the rope and praying to the goddess. Whether this reflects actual events or the kind of storytelling that makes historical moments more memorable, it shows how Romans came to remember Cybele's dramatic arrival as something approaching a miracle. The timing seemed almost impossibly perfect, the way coincidences sometimes align in ways that make even skeptics wonder about divine intervention. Within months of the goddess reaching Rome, Hannibal withdrew from Italy, ending a war that had brought the empire to the brink of collapse. Whether you attribute this to celestial assistance or simple military exhaustion on Hannibal's part, the result was identical. Cybele had apparently delivered on her promise, earning herself a permanent place in Roman religious life. The Senate responded with characteristic Roman efficiency, building her a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, right at the heart of imperial power where everyone could see that Rome honoured its divine allies appropriately. But they also hedged their bets with the kind of careful legislation that showed they hadn't completely abandoned their cultural anxieties. Roman citizens were forbidden from joining the Galli's ranks. Only foreigners could become these devoted priests. The goddess could stay, along with her protective powers, but her most challenging servants would remain permanent outsiders. It was a compromise that satisfied Rome's practical need for divine assistance while maintaining some boundaries around traditional Roman identity. The Galli brought with them not just their unusual appearance and practices, but an entire mythology that explained their extraordinary devotion. Cybele, they taught, had once loved a beautiful young shepherd named Attis, with the kind of divine passion that creates both wonder and tragedy. When Attis betrayed her by falling in love with a mortal woman, the jealous goddess drove him mad with grief and divine fury. In his religious frenzy, Attis made the ultimate sacrifice beneath a pine tree, bleeding to death in an act of devotion that was both self-destruction and spiritual transformation. Cybele, overwhelmed with remorse and eternal love, transformed him into an evergreen pine and mourned him with the kind of cosmic grief that changes the natural world. This wasn't merely an entertaining story to the Galli, it was their spiritual blueprint, the sacred narrative that gave meaning to their own profound sacrifices. By following Attis's example, they believed they could join Cybele in her eternal mourning, while gaining access to divine powers that ordinary mortals could never reach. Through their physical transformation, they claimed the ability to see the future, communicate directly with the goddess, and transcend the normal boundaries that separated male from female, human from divine. Roman writers struggled to understand them with the kind of fascination that comes from encountering something completely outside your cultural experience. Catullus wrote a haunting poem about a young man named Attis, who underwent the sacred transformation in religious fervour, only to experience anguish and confusion once the ecstatic trance had passed. It's a piece of literature that captures both the appeal and the cost of such complete religious dedication. Ovid described their striking appearance with the eye of someone who found them simultaneously alien and compelling. Long hair streaming in the wind like banners, bronze cymbals creating music that seemed to come from another world, voices calling out the goddess's sacred names with an intensity that made ordinary prayer sound half-hearted by comparison. For all their strangeness by Roman standards, the Galli served an essential function that even their cultural critics had to acknowledge. Cybele was a mother goddess, protector of cities, and bringer of fertility to a world where famine, plague, and warfare constantly threatened survival. Her priests offered hope through their ultimate sacrifice, having given up everything that Roman society considered essential to masculine identity. Their physical wholeness, their ability to have families, their place in normal social structures, all to serve the goddess who had saved Rome from its greatest military crisis. The arrangement worked with the kind of practical magic that Romans appreciated most. Cybele's presence seemed to guarantee continued prosperity. Her priests became a permanent fixture in the city's religious landscape, and Rome avoided any more existential military crises. The priests might look and act like nothing Romans had ever seen, but they had earned their place through blood, devotion, and apparent divine favour. The goddess who had helped defeat Hannibal deserved her unusual servants, no matter how uncomfortable they made traditional Romans feel when they encountered them in the streets. It was a compromise that satisfied everyone's needs, while challenging everyone's assumptions about how religion, gender, and cultural identity were supposed to work. Every march in Rome, the streets transformed into something that existed somewhere between a religious festival and a public spectacle that left witnesses feeling they had glimpsed something both sacred and slightly overwhelming. The festival of Cybele stretched across several days of increasingly intense celebration, but March 24th, the Day of Blood, marked its most profound and challenging climax. The Galli emerged from their temple quarters like actors preparing for the most important performance of their lives, dressed in their sacred regalia that announced their unique identity to everyone in the city. Bright yellow silk robes caught the morning sunlight, their faces painted with cosmetics applied with the same reverence other priests used for handling sacred vessels, jewellery glinting as they moved, and long hair decorated with ribbons and flowers that created an appearance both beautiful and deliberately challenging to Roman gender conventions. To most Roman observers, they appeared feminine at first glance, but their deeper voices and taller frames reminded everyone of their male origins and the extraordinary journey they had undertaken. These were men who had chosen something that existed beyond ordinary concepts of masculine identity, creating themselves anew in service to their goddess. The procession began with music that started as entertainment and gradually became something closer to collective hypnosis. Flutes, drums, and crashing cymbals created rhythms that seemed to possess both priests and spectators, building in intensity as the day progressed toward its sacred purpose. The Galli danced through Rome's streets with movements that became wilder as the music grew more frenzied, their choreography telling the story of Attis and Cybele while preparing everyone present for the day's most profound ritual. Historical sources describe what happened next with the kind of detailed fascination that comes from witnessing something that challenges every assumption about human behaviour and religious devotion. The priests began a ritual of sacred bloodletting, using whips, knives, and even broken pottery to create wounds on their arms, chests, and backs. Blood splattered across their silk robes and onto the cobblestones as they spun in ecstatic dances, their wounds serving as offerings to Cybele and demonstrations of their complete dedication. This wasn't random violence or self-harm as we might understand it today. The Galli believed their blood pleased the goddess and renewed her power over the natural world, the same way other cultures might offer animal sacrifices or precious metals. The physical pain also induced altered states of consciousness that they claimed allowed them to prophesy and channel divine messages, transforming suffering into spiritual communication. But the day's most extraordinary moment came when new initiates completed their sacred transformation. Young men, always foreigners since Roman law prevented citizens from joining the priesthood, would find themselves swept up in the music, dancing, and collective spiritual intensity. In moments of religious ecstasy that they believed came directly from the goddess, they would take up sharp stones or pottery shards and make the ultimate sacrifice, offering their severed masculinity to Cybele's statue as the most complete gift they could imagine. Ancient writers like Lucretius and Prudentius recorded these scenes with the kind of horrified fascination that comes from witnessing something that exists far outside normal human experience. Crowds pressed forward to see the transformation, their reactions mixing revulsion with awe, understanding they were observing something sacred even if they couldn't fully grasp its spiritual meaning. Some spectators fainted at the sight of blood, while others threw coins and jewellery, recognizing they had witnessed a level of religious devotion that demanded respect regardless of their personal feelings about it. The newly transformed priests received immediate medical care from experienced Galli, who had learned over centuries how to prevent deadly infections and manage the physical recovery process. Healing took weeks, during which the initiates remained in the temple complex, cared for by their new spiritual brothers and slowly adapting to their transformed bodies, changed voices, and completely altered relationship with the world around them. These weren't impulsive acts of desperation or mental illness. The transformation had to occur during the festival's emotional peak, using implements blessed by the goddess, and spring from genuine religious conviction rather than personal crisis or psychological disturbance. The Galli had developed careful protocols over generations to ensure that initiates fully understood the permanent nature of their sacrifice and were making their choice from authentic spiritual calling rather than temporary emotional distress. Once healed, the new priests faced a lifetime unlike anything else in Roman society, creating their own community within the larger empire while serving needs that no one else could meet. They lived communally in the temple complex, supporting themselves through religious services, fortune-telling, and donations from followers who valued their unique spiritual abilities. Their transformation changed everything about their voices, which became high and distinctive, creating a sonic signature that announced their presence throughout Rome's streets as they offered prophecies and blessings to anyone willing to pay for divine guidance. This physical change became their trademark, making them immediately recognizable and somehow adding authority to their spiritual pronouncements. The Galli's appearance deliberately challenged Roman gender categories in ways that created both discomfort and fascination. They weren't trying to become women in any simple sense. They occupied a third space that was neither male nor female, but something entirely different, something that existed specifically for religious purposes. This ambiguity gave them unique social powers, allowing them to enter spaces forbidden to men and interact with women in ways that would have scandalized ordinary males. Their prophetic abilities earned them clients throughout Roman society, from merchants seeking advice about business ventures to wealthy matrons wanting guidance about family matters. Politicians, though rarely admitting it publicly, sometimes requested private consultations about their careers and fortunes, understanding that the Galli's perspective came from a completely different relationship with divine forces. The priests claimed their sacrifice unlocked supernatural abilities that were denied to intact men. Without sexual desire to distract them, they could focus entirely on divine communication. Their permanent physical transformation proved their devotion to Cybele, earning them her special favour and protection in return for their ultimate offering. Dawn found the Galli beginning another day in a society that simultaneously needed them and never quite knew what to make of them, navigating the complex space between sacred duty and practical survival. Their morning routines revealed the careful balance they maintained between shocking religious theatre and the ordinary human needs that even the most devoted priests couldn't escape. They applied makeup with the same reverence other priests used to clean sacred vessels, understanding that their appearance was itself a form of religious expression. They chose jewellery that served both spiritual and aesthetic purposes, creating a visual identity that announced their sacred status while expressing individual personality within their collective calling. Each morning brought preparation for another day of navigating Roman prejudices with wit, wisdom, and unshakable religious conviction. The temple buzzed with organised activity that might have surprised Romans who imagined the Galli as chaotic figures living entirely outside normal social structures. Senior priests assigned daily tasks to newer initiates based on their developing talents and the community's practical needs. Some Galli possessed natural gifts for prophecy and would work the crowds at markets and public spaces, offering divine guidance to anyone seeking spiritual direction. Others had learned to read the anxieties of wealthy Romans and would visit private homes, performing purification rituals and offering spiritual counsel that combined religious authority with psychological insight. A few remained at the temple throughout the day, maintaining the sacred spaces and preparing for evening ceremonies that renewed their connection to Cybele while strengthening the bonds that held their unusual community together. These domestic responsibilities were as important as their public religious duties, creating the stable foundation that allowed their more dramatic spiritual work to continue. Their economic survival depended entirely on these diverse services, since Roman law that prevented citizens from joining their ranks also limited official temple funding. The Galli supported themselves through donations, fees for religious consultations, and the generosity of followers who believed in Cybele's protective power. This financial vulnerability kept them connected to ordinary Romans, despite their extraordinary lifestyle, ensuring they remained responsive to the spiritual needs of the people they served. Morning clients arrived as the sun climbed higher, bringing the kinds of human concerns that transcend cultural boundaries. A nervous merchant's wife sought reassurance about her husband's dangerous trading voyage to Alexandria. A young soldier wanted to know if he would survive his upcoming campaign in the Germanic forests. A senator's mother, heavily veiled to avoid recognition, slipped through a side entrance to ask whether her son's political ambitions would bring glory or disaster to their family name. The The Galli listened with practiced attention, their high voices offering carefully crafted responses that mixed psychological insight with religious authority. They had learned to read people as skillfully as they claimed to read divine omens, understanding that successful prophecy required human wisdom as much as supernatural inspiration. Their predictions often proved remarkably accurate, whether through genuine spiritual intuition, careful observation of social and political trends, or simple statistical understanding of how human affairs usually unfold. Walking through Rome's streets in their distinctive dress always attracted attention that ranged from curious to hostile. Children followed them with fascinated wonder, asking questions that adults were too polite or too prejudiced to voice. Adults whispered and pointed, their reactions spanning from respectful greetings to crude jokes and gestures that revealed more about the observers than about the priests themselves. The Galli had developed thick skins and quick wit to handle harassment, often silencing mockers with well-timed prophecies that contained enough uncomfortable personal truth to be genuinely unsettling. Their ability to see through social pretenses, whether through divine insight or simple psychological acuity, gave them a form of protection that physical strength could never have provided. Their legal ambiguity created unexpected advantages in a society obsessed with clear social categories. Women generally showed them more respect and curiosity than hostility, perhaps recognizing kindred spirits in their rejection of conventional masculine roles and their creation of alternative ways of being in the world. Evening brought the community together for their most private rituals, the intimate moments that sustained their extraordinary public mission. Behind closed temple doors, the Galli shared meals, gossip, and the deep bonds that replaced traditional family relationships. They cared for sick members with the dedication of blood relatives, celebrated the anniversaries of their transformation like birthdays, and passed down oral traditions that preserved their religious knowledge across generations. The Galli's lives were filled with both spiritual devotion and everyday struggles that reflected their humanity beyond the dramatic public rituals they performed. Though they had renounced traditional family structures, they still faced the universal fears of aging without support and the loss of romantic relationships, or the chance to have children. However, their sacrifice also brought them a deep sense of fulfillment through their faith and the close, meaningful bonds they shared within their community. Their presence in Rome subtly reshaped cultural ideas, especially around gender and identity. By choosing celibacy and rejecting societal pressures to marry, the Galli offered an alternative way of finding purpose through spirituality, rather than through conventional family life. Their dedication to foreign practices opened Roman minds to new religious concepts, eventually influencing later shifts in Roman spirituality. Over time, some Romans came to respect the Galli's commitment to their beliefs, recognizing in them the same ideals of devotion and sacrifice that were valued in Roman culture, even though the expression of these ideals was foreign. This eventually laid the groundwork for new religious movements, including Christianity, which would adopt some of the Galli's practices, such as celibacy and physical sacrifice for spiritual transformation. The Galli's story provides us with a unique lens through which we can view how ancient societies navigated cultural diversity during times of change. Rome's pragmatic approach allowed it to benefit from Cybele's divine protection, while preserving its traditional identity by limiting the influence of her most radical servants. The Galli's enduring legacy reveals how spiritual practices can transcend the boundaries of gender, identity, and societal norms, showing that sometimes the most profound paths to divinity come from those who live outside of conventional expectations. Their sacrifices, though extreme, created meaning and purpose, and their example continues to challenge how we think about religion, identity, and community. Picture Rome in 39 BC, a city where the very air seemed to crackle with political tension and the constant possibility that someone you had dinner with last week might be your mortal enemy by next Tuesday. The Republic was dying a slow, violent death, and powerful men were carving up the known world like a particularly contentious family inheritance. In this chaos of civil wars and shifting alliances, a 20-year-old woman named Livia Drusilla made a decision that would reshape the Roman Empire for the next half-century. She left her husband. Now, this might not sound particularly revolutionary to modern ears, but in Roman society, where women were expected to be seen and not heard, where divorce required careful legal maneuvering, and where leaving your spouse for another man could trigger political scandals that lasted for generations, Livia's choice was the equivalent of announcing she intended to rewrite the rules of power itself. Her husband was Tiberius Claudius Nero, a perfectly respectable Roman nobleman who had made the fatal political miscalculation of backing Mark Antony against Octavian in the civil wars that were tearing the Republic apart. When it became clear that Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, was going to win, Nero found himself on the wrong side of history with a target painted on his family's future. The man Livia chose instead was Octavian himself, the most powerful and dangerous person in the Mediterranean world. She was pregnant with her second child when she made this decision, which adds a layer of practical complexity that makes you wonder about the logistics of ancient divorce proceedings. Imagine explaining to people that you're leaving your husband for his political enemy while visibly expecting another child, and you'll get some sense of the social scandal this must have created. But Livia understood something that most of her contemporaries missed. The old world was ending, and whoever aligned themselves with the new order would write the rules for the next one. She wasn't just changing husbands, she was changing the course of history, though she did it so gracefully that many people at the time probably thought she was simply following her heart rather than her exceptionally sharp political instincts. The marriage between Livia and Octavian became one of the most successful political partnerships in human history, though you'd never know it from reading official Roman sources, which maintained the polite fiction that emperors made decisions entirely on their own, while their wives concerned themselves with appropriately feminine pursuits like weaving and household management. For nearly 53 years, Livia perfected the art of wielding enormous influence while appearing to have none at all. She became the power behind the throne, who was so skilled at remaining invisible that historians are still debating exactly how much control she actually exercised over the empire that her husband officially ruled. When Augustus transformed Rome from a republic into an empire, he faced a delicate challenge that would have tested the most skilled political theorists. How do you establish absolute power in a society that has spent centuries defining itself in opposition to monarchy? His solution was ingenious. He kept all the traditional republican institutions while quietly ensuring that he controlled them completely. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, and laws were still passed, but somehow Augustus always seemed to get exactly what he wanted. Livia faced a parallel challenge that was, if anything, even more complex. Roman society had very clear ideas about where women belonged in the political hierarchy, and that place was emphatically not at the centre of imperial decision-making. Traditional Roman women were expected to be virtuous, modest, and devoted to domestic concerns. They could wield influence within their households and perhaps offer gentle counsel to their husbands on private matters, but they were absolutely not supposed to be actively shaping policy for the world's largest empire. So Livia developed what we might call the politics of strategic invisibility. She learned to exercise power so subtly that even people who were watching for it couldn't quite prove it was happening. She perfected the art of making suggestions that somehow always seemed to become imperial policy, while maintaining the appearance of being nothing more than a devoted wife, who occasionally shared her husband's burdens. Her daily routine became a masterclass in political theatre. Each morning she would receive visitors in her private quarters, senators' wives seeking favours, wealthy merchants hoping for advantageous trade agreements, foreign dignitaries wanting to understand Roman policy. Officially, these were social calls, the kind of polite visits that any prominent Roman matron might receive. Unofficially, they were diplomatic negotiations that often determined the fate of provinces, military campaigns, and vast commercial enterprises. She learned to speak in a kind of political code that allowed her to communicate her wishes without appearing to give orders. A casual comment about how much Augustus valued loyalty from provincial governors might reach the right ears and result in policy changes that affected millions of people. An observation about the wisdom of certain military strategies shared during a dinner party could influence campaign planning without anyone being able to point to a specific moment when the emperor's wife had interfered in military affairs. The key to her success was understanding that in Roman culture, appearance mattered as much as reality. As long as she maintained the proper forms of feminine behaviour, dressing modestly, speaking softly, deferring publicly to her husband's authority, she could get away with exercising influence that would have been scandalous if expressed more directly. Augustus seemed to understand and appreciate this arrangement. In private letters that survived into later centuries, he frequently consulted Livia on everything from personnel decisions to foreign policy. He trusted her judgment on matters ranging from the appointment of provincial governors to the complex diplomatic negotiations that kept the empire's borders stable. But in public, he was careful to maintain the fiction that she was simply his beloved wife, who provided emotional support and domestic tranquility. This partnership worked so well that it became the template for all future imperial marriages. Later emperors' wives studied Livia's methods, learning how to wield influence without triggering the kind of political backlash that could destroy careers and dynasties. She essentially created the job description for Roman empresses, establishing precedents that would last for centuries. Her influence extended far beyond individual policy decisions. Livia helped shape the entire culture of imperial Rome, establishing social norms and expectations that defined how the new monarchy would function. She hosted elaborate dinner parties that became crucial networking events for the political elite. She patronized artists, writers, and philosophers, helping to create the cultural atmosphere that would define the Augustan age. She managed the complex protocols of imperial life, determining who could approach the emperor and under what circumstances. Most remarkably, she did all of this while maintaining the public image of traditional Roman womanhood. Ancient sources consistently describe her as modest, virtuous, and devoted to her family. Even historians who are clearly aware of her political influence wrote about her in terms that emphasized her feminine virtues rather than her strategic brilliance. It's a testament to her skill that she managed to exercise unprecedented power while remaining, in the eyes of her contemporaries, an exemplary Roman wife. The Roman people seemed to accept this arrangement partly because Livia was so careful to observe the proper forms of behaviour. She never appeared in the Senate, never gave public speeches, and never directly contradicted her husband in any forum where others might witness it. She understood that the substance of power mattered more than its appearance, and she was content to let Augustus receive public credit for decisions she had helped make, as long as she could continue to influence the outcomes that actually affected the empire's future. This system of parallel authority worked because both Augustus and Livia understood that successful governance required more than military prowess or administrative efficiency. It required the kind of social intelligence that could navigate the complex web of personal relationships, family loyalties, and cultural expectations that held Roman society together. Augustus brought political vision and organizational skills to their partnership, while Livia contributed the interpersonal finesse that transformed potential enemies into allies and turned policy proposals into widely accepted imperial edicts. By the time Augustus had been emperor for 2 decades, Livia had become something unprecedented in Roman history. A woman whose political survival didn't depend entirely on her husband's continued favour or the accidents of childbirth. She had built her own network of allies, cultivated her own sources of information, and established her own reputation for wisdom and reliability that existed independently of her marriage. This was extraordinary in a world where even the most powerful women were usually just one family crisis away from political irrelevance. Roman wives could be divorced at their husband's whim, and widowhood often meant immediate exile from the circles of power where they had once moved freely. But Livia had made herself so valuable to so many different people that her position became virtually unassailable. She achieved this security through what modern political scientists might recognize as sophisticated network building. Over the years, she had done favors for hundreds of people, securing appointments for ambitious young senators, arranging advantageous marriages for wealthy families, interceding with Augustus on behalf of individuals who had fallen from favor. These weren't random acts of kindness. They were strategic investments in a web of mutual obligation that would protect her interests for decades to come. Her approach to building influence was methodical and patient. When a young senator showed promise, she would find subtle ways to support his career, perhaps by ensuring that Augustus noticed his talents or by arranging for him to be invited to important social gatherings. When a provincial governor proved particularly effective, she would make sure that his successes were mentioned in the emperor's presence. When wealthy merchants needed permits or legal assistance, she would quietly facilitate their requests through appropriate channels. The brilliance of this system was that it created genuine loyalty rather than mere fear or obligation. The people Livia helped understood that she was using her influence on their behalf, and they appreciated her discretion in doing so. Unlike some political patrons who demanded public acknowledgement of their assistance, Livia was content to let her beneficiaries take credit for their successes as long as they remembered where their opportunities had originated. This network of allies served multiple purposes beyond simple political insurance. It provided Livia with an intelligence-gathering system that rivaled anything the imperial government possessed through official channels. Senators' wives would share gossip about their husbands' political plans. Merchants would report on economic conditions in distant provinces. Foreign visitors would reveal information about their government's true intentions. All of this information flowed back to Livia, giving her a comprehensive understanding of the empire's political landscape that few people could match. She used this information not for personal gain, but to help Augustus govern more effectively. When potential problems were developing in remote provinces, she could alert him before they became crises. When senators were planning opposition to imperial policies, she could suggest alternative approaches that might win their support. When foreign governments were considering hostile actions, she could recommend diplomatic initiatives that might prevent conflicts before they began. Perhaps most importantly, Livia developed an almost supernatural ability to read the long-term consequences of political decisions. While Augustus often focused on immediate challenges and short-term solutions, she thought in terms of decades and generations. This perspective proved invaluable in managing the transition from republic to empire, which required careful attention to how current policies would affect future stability. Her influence on succession planning became particularly crucial as Augustus aged, and the question of who would inherit his power became increasingly urgent. The Roman Empire had no established mechanisms for peaceful transfers of power. The very concept of hereditary monarchy was still officially unacceptable to a society that prided itself on republican traditions. Yet everyone understood that the empire's stability depended on avoiding the kind of civil wars that had destroyed the republic in the first place. Livia's sons from her first marriage, Tiberius and Drusus, were obvious candidates for succession, but Augustus also had relatives from his own family who had legitimate claims to consideration. The situation required delicate manoeuvring to ensure that the most capable person inherited power, while avoiding the appearance of establishing a dynasty based purely on family connections. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Livia carefully managed this succession crisis through a combination of strategic marriages, military appointments and political promotions that positioned her elder son Tiberius as the natural heir to imperial authority. She did this so skillfully that when Augustus finally died in 14 AD, the transition occurred smoothly despite the complete absence of constitutional precedents for how imperial power should be transferred. The fact that Tiberius became emperor without civil war or significant political upheaval was largely due to Livia's patient work in building consensus among the various factions that might have opposed his accession. She had spent years cultivating relationships with military commanders, senate leaders, and provincial governors, ensuring that when the moment came, there would be broad support for her son's claim to power. This success in managing the succession established a precedent that would influence Roman politics for centuries. Future imperial transitions would follow the pattern that Livia had established, with emperors' wives playing crucial but officially invisible roles in determining how power passed from one generation to the next. Her achievement becomes even more remarkable when you consider that she accomplished all of this while maintaining the public image of a traditional Roman matron who was devoted primarily to her family and household responsibilities. Ancient sources consistently portray her as a model of feminine virtue, emphasizing her modesty, her devotion to Augustus, and her skill in domestic management. Yet beneath this conventional exterior, she was operating one of the most sophisticated political machines in Roman history. When Augustus died in 14 AD, Livia faced the most dangerous moment of her long political career. After 53 years of marriage to the emperor, she had become so accustomed to wielding influence that the prospect of returning to the powerless status of an ordinary Roman widow must have seemed unthinkable. Yet Roman tradition offered no role for the mother of an emperor, and many people expected her to retire gracefully from public life, to spend her remaining years in appropriate feminine pursuits. Tiberius, her son and the new emperor, presented a particular challenge. Unlike Augustus, who had genuinely valued Livia's counsel and relied on her political judgment, Tiberius found his mother's continued involvement in government affairs both irritating and potentially embarrassing. He understood that his legitimacy as emperor depended partly on maintaining the fiction that Roman men made political decisions independently, without feminine interference. Having his mother continue to exercise the kind of influence she had wielded during Augustus's reign would undermine the masculine authority that Roman culture associated with effective leadership. But Livia had spent too many decades building her power base to simply step aside gracefully. More importantly, she understood that the Roman Empire's stability might depend on her continued involvement in managing the complex relationships and delicate balances that held the imperial system together. Too many people had come to rely on her judgment and intervention for her to withdraw completely from political life. So she embarked on perhaps the most delicate phase of her career, maintaining political influence while appearing to respect her son's authority as emperor. It was a balancing act that required all the skills she had developed over the previous half-century, along with new levels of subtlety and patience. Officially, Livia received the title Augusta, making her the first woman in Roman history to be honoured with a name that indicated semi-divine status. This was unprecedented recognition for a woman who had never held any official political position, and it reflected both her extraordinary influence and the empire's need to find some way to acknowledge her contributions without creating dangerous precedents for future imperial wives. The title gave her a degree of formal recognition that protected her from the worst consequences of political irrelevance, while establishing her as a figure of respect and authority in her own right. It allowed her to continue receiving the kinds of visitors and conducting the kinds of conversations that had made her such an effective behind-the-scenes operator during Augustus's reign. However, Tiberius made it clear that he expected her to exercise this authority carefully and discreetly. She could continue to receive petitioners and offer advice, but she was not to interfere directly in imperial administration or contradict his decisions in any public forum. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed both mother and son to maintain their dignity while preserving the essential functions of imperial government. In practice, Livia found ways to work within these constraints that maintained much of her practical influence, while respecting the forms of masculine authority that Roman culture demanded. She continued to host social gatherings that served as informal diplomatic conferences. She maintained correspondence with provincial governors and foreign leaders who valued her counsel. She intervened discreetly in personnel decisions and policy discussions when she felt her input could prevent problems or improve outcomes. The key to her continued effectiveness was understanding that influence could be exercised through relationships and reputation, even when formal authority was limited. People throughout the empire had learned to trust her judgment over the course of decades, and they continued to seek her advice even when she could no longer claim to speak for the emperor himself. This period of her life also revealed the extent to which she had become a political institution in her own right. Foreign embassies continued to request meetings with her, understanding that her perspective on Roman policy carried weight regardless of her official status. Wealthy Romans still sought her intervention in legal and business matters, recognizing that her word could open doors that might otherwise remain closed. Provincial communities honoured her with temples and statues, acknowledging her role in maintaining the peace and prosperity that had characterized the Augustan age. Perhaps most remarkably, Livia managed to maintain this influence for 15 years after Augustus's death, remaining a significant figure in Roman politics until her own death in 29 AD at the age of 86. This longevity was extraordinary in a political system where even emperors rarely survived for more than a few years, and it testified to both her political skills and the genuine respect she had earned from people throughout the empire. Her relationship with Tiberius remained complicated throughout this period. There were frequent tensions over policy decisions and personnel matters, with Tiberius sometimes rejecting his mother's advice in ways that seemed designed more to assert his independence than to improve imperial administration. Yet he never moved to strip her of the title Augusta or prevent her from maintaining the social and political connections that gave her continued influence. This dynamic established another important precedent for future imperial families. Later emperors would face similar challenges in managing the political roles of their female relatives, and they would often look to the Livia-Tiberius relationship as a model for how these tensions could be managed without destroying either family harmony or governmental effectiveness. When Livia finally died in 29 AD, her funeral became a state occasion that revealed the true extent of her influence on Roman political life. Senators, generals, provincial governors, and foreign ambassadors attended ceremonies that honoured not just her personal virtues, but her contributions to imperial administration. The fact that she was mourned throughout the empire as a political figure in her own right, rather than simply as the wife and mother of emperors, demonstrated how completely she had transformed Roman expectations about women's roles in public life. Yet even in death, she maintained the careful balance between recognition and discretion that had characterized her entire career. Official accounts of her funeral emphasized her traditional feminine virtues, her devotion to family, her modest behavior, her skill in household management. The political achievements that modern historians recognize as her true legacy were acknowledged through honors and ceremonies rather than explicit biographical accounts. This pattern of recognition through omission would characterize how Livia was remembered by subsequent generations. Everyone understood that she had been extraordinarily influential, but the exact nature and extent of that influence remained deliberately vague. She had succeeded so completely in exercising power while appearing not to have it that even ancient historians struggle to describe precisely what she had accomplished. The influence Livia wielded over Roman politics didn't end with her death. It became woven into the very fabric of how imperial power functioned for the next several centuries. Every subsequent emperor's wife would be measured against the precedent she had established, and many would attempt to follow the model she had created for exercising influence while maintaining the appearance of traditional feminine behavior. Her approach to power became what we might call the Livia template, a set of strategies and techniques that allowed women to exercise political influence within a system that officially excluded them from formal authority. This template included everything from the careful cultivation of personal relationships to the strategic use of social gatherings as informal diplomatic venues, from the patient accumulation of favours and obligations to the subtle manipulation of information flows that shaped imperial decision-making. Future empresses studied Livia's methods with the dedication of students preparing for the most important examination of their lives. They learned to read between the lines of her public behaviour, understanding that her apparent modesty and deference concealed sophisticated political calculations. They recognized that her success came not from challenging the system directly, but from finding ways to work within its constraints while gradually expanding what was considered acceptable behavior for women in their position. Some of these later empresses achieved a remarkable success by following Livia's example. Plotina, the wife of Emperor Trajan, wielded significant influence over policy during one of Rome's most prosperous periods, yet maintained such careful adherence to traditional feminine roles that even critical historians praised her as a model of wifely virtue. Julia Domna, who served as regent for her son Emperor Caligula, managed to exercise virtually imperial authority while officially holding no position at all. Others discovered the limitations of Livia's approach when they attempted to be more direct in exercising power. Agrippina the Younger, who was both Caligula's sister and Nero's mother, tried to wield influence more openly and ultimately triggered a backlash that cost her life. Messalina, Claudius's wife, abandoned Livia's careful discretion entirely and was executed when her political machinations became too visible for the Senate to ignore. These contrasting outcomes demonstrated both the effectiveness of Livia's methods and their essential limitations. The system she had created allowed women to exercise substantial influence, but only as long as they were careful never to appear to be challenging male authority directly. It was a compromise that enabled individual women to achieve remarkable things while ensuring that the broader structures of gender hierarchy remained intact. Perhaps Livia's most lasting contribution to Roman political culture was her demonstration that effective governance required the kinds of social and interpersonal skills that Roman society typically associated with feminine behaviour. Her success showed that empire could not be managed through military force and administrative efficiency alone. It also required the ability to read people's motivations, build consensus among competing factions, and maintain the delicate web of personal relationships that held the political system together. This insight influenced how later emperors approached their own political challenges. Many of them learned to value and seek out the kinds of counsel that women in their families could provide, Understanding that feminine perspectives on politics often revealed important dynamics that male politicians missed. The imperial court became a place where informal influence was recognized as being just as important as formal authority, and where the ability to manage social relationships was considered an essential skill for effective leadership. Modern historians studying the Roman Empire have gradually come to recognize that Livia's approach to power was not an anomaly or a clever workaround within a masculine political system. It was actually a crucial component of how imperial government functioned successfully for several centuries. Her methods became so thoroughly integrated into Roman political culture that later empires and monarchies throughout Europe would adopt similar approaches to managing the roles of powerful women within officially patriarchal systems. The Byzantine Empire, which considered itself the direct continuation of Roman civilization, elevated this model to an art form. Byzantine empresses routinely exercised enormous influence while maintaining elaborate fictions about their subordinate status. Some, like Theodora and Irene, eventually dispensed with these fictions entirely and ruled as empresses in their own right, but they built on foundations that Livia had established centuries earlier. Even in medieval and early modern Europe, royal women would study accounts of Livia's career as a guide to navigating the complex relationship between gender and power in court societies. Her strategies for building influence through personal relationships, managing information flows, and exercising authority through unofficial channels became standard techniques for queens and noble women throughout the continent. Yet there's something both inspiring and troubling about Livia's legacy. On one hand, she demonstrated that women could achieve extraordinary things even within systems designed to exclude them from power. She proved that intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking could overcome formal limitations and create opportunities for influence that their creators never intended. On the other hand, her success depended on accepting and reinforcing the very gender hierarchies that limited women's opportunities in the first place. She achieved power by appearing powerless, gained influence by seeming to lack ambition, and shaped imperial policy while pretending to be concerned only with domestic matters. Her methods were brilliant, but they required a level of deception and self-denial that few people could sustain over the course of a lifetime. Perhaps most significantly, Livia's approach to power created a model that was almost impossible for other women to replicate successfully. Her achievements depended on a unique combination of personal circumstances, historical timing, and individual talents that could not be easily transferred to different situations or different personalities. She succeeded partly because she was genuinely exceptional, and partly because she was fortunate enough to live during a period when the Roman political system was flexible enough to accommodate her innovations. The woman who ruled Rome while pretending she didn't remains one of history's most complex figures, simultaneously a pioneer who expanded possibilities for women's political participation and a collaborator who helped maintain systems that limited those possibilities. Her story reminds us that power is often exercised most effectively when it remains invisible, and that the most lasting influence sometimes comes from people who are careful never to appear too influential. In the end, Livia's greatest achievement may have been proving that politics is fundamentally about human relationships rather than formal institutions. She understood that empires are held together by personal trust, mutual obligation, and shared understanding rather than laws and military force alone. By mastering the art of building and maintaining these relationships, she helped create a political system that survived for centuries and influenced how power would be exercised throughout the Western world. The empress, who never officially existed, had created a template for wielding influence that would outlast all the emperors whose authority she had helped to establish and maintain. Her invisible hand had shaped the visible world in ways that continue to resonate through our understanding of how politics, gender, and power intersect in complex societies. She had learned to rule by appearing not to rule, and in doing so, she discovered something profound about the nature of authority itself. And so we reach the end of our journey through the hidden corners of Roman history, where we've discovered that the empire's most fascinating stories often belong to people who defied every expectation about what Roman life was supposed to be. From Elagabalus, the teenage priest-emperor who tried to turn Rome into his personal temple, to Caligula, whose supposed madness may have been nothing more than political incompetence dressed up in centuries of gossip. From the Galli priests who sacrificed everything for their goddess, to Livia, who ruled an empire while pretending to be just a devoted wife. These weren't the Romans you learned about in school, the noble senators and conquering generals whose marble statues still gaze down at us with stone-carved dignity. These were the people who coloured outside the lines of Roman respectability, who found their own ways of being human in a civilization that had very specific ideas about what humanity should look like. Each of their stories reminds us that history is made by real people, with real desires, real fears, and real obsessions that don't always fit neatly into the categories that later generations used to organise the past. They were all products of their time, certainly, but they were also individuals who made choices that surprised their contemporaries and continue to fascinate us nearly 2,000 years later. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of Roman streets where anything was possible, where teenage emperors could declare themselves gods, where gender was more fluid than marble statues suggest, where power moved through networks invisible to official histories, and where the most ordinary human desires could reshape the world's largest empire in ways both beautiful and strange. The Romans built their monuments to last forever, and many of them have, but the stories that truly endure aren't carved in marble. They're the ones that remind us that, even in the most distant past, people were gloriously, confusingly, recognisably human. Sleep well, and thank you for joining me on this journey through the Rome that history almost forgot to remember.